Firstly, just to say it's a real honor to be here, and thank you to Dr. Ghassan for the invitation. Dr. Ghassan is one of my heroes, so when he asks me to do something, I just say yes. But it's lovely to be here, and particularly in Jordan. I've never been to Jordan before, so this is my first time, and it's always been something on that bucket list. So it's just wonderful to be here, and thank you everybody for the hospitality. I also want to say I do feel a little bit like a sort of an interloper, someone who in a way shouldn't be here somehow. I'm going to talk about a lot of the things I talk a lot about in South Africa, in Kenya, and when I travel, but actually to be here in this region feels like I don't want to be, you know what this region is about, not me. And I think I'm going to try and talk about the global, but I think, and I believe firmly that what's happening right now in Gaza and in the region is global, and I have worries about what it says, obviously for Gaza, but I think also about the future, particularly on my continent, Africa, which suffers from a lot of the same things around poverty, around discrimination, around racism, around people that are seen as not as good as other people and that are seen as dispensable. And I think what's happening in Gaza is potentially a warning as well for the future, and I'm going to touch on some of that. So just briefly by way of introduction, as Ghassan said, I'm the co-director of the Institute, and we do work all over the African continent. We've done work in India, in Nepal. We're currently with War Child, doing some work in Yemen and Central African Republic and South Sudan. So we've done work in many, many places. The largest work, as I was saying to Joan at breakfast this morning, is we've done 2 intervention randomized controlled trials starting in pregnancy, and that's my first sort of interest is maternal and child health, and then infant mental health, and then child development. But if you're lucky enough to get funding to follow those mothers, their babies, they become toddlers, they go to kindergarten, then they go to school, and then they become adolescents. And so I started out being interested in infants and young children, and now I've also had to become a bit of not an expert, but knowledgeable about adolescents as well, because as we all know, children grow. And this is a quote I have in every talk I do now, and I don't mind what the talk's about, because I think it sums up our current situation. So for those of you that don't know, James Baldwin was an amazing American writer. If you haven't read him, read him. Do yourself a favor. He speaks to all the issues that we're interested in. Just the most amazing man. And this quote for me is, "The children are always ours, every single one of them, all over the globe." And I'm beginning to suspect that whoever is incapable of recognizing this may be incapable of morality. And for me, I always start with that quote. So we spoke a lot about the polycrisis. So this is a term that I'm ashamed to admit I only discovered in 2023, when UNICEF used it in a document at the end of the COVID pandemic, and as you all know, that's the definition that UNICEF gave. And I've used this a lot, and I'm going to speak about a report that I wrote for Grand Challenges Canada and EGDAN, and I used this report a lot. And so it was this, I just loved the concept. And then I discovered, so this was in 2023. I then discovered that there was this other term called in a sort of problématique. So this term is very similar, almost word for word definition, a complex set of intertwined global problems, inequality, pollution, scarcity, disease. And this term problématique was coined in 1970. So, and then I discovered that the first time the word polycrisis had been used was in fact in the 1980s by a French writer. And why this struck a chord for me is that I was saying to someone yesterday, in research, in the work, a lot of the work we do, we are very good at reinventing the wheel. We research the same things again and again when we actually know the answer. And I always say, there are no physicists out there who are now doing their PhDs on gravity. It's established. We don't need to do it anymore. And we're not good in our field of saying we know some stuff and now let's just actually act and stop researching. So that's why the term, this sort of the fact that it's an old term struck me. But equally, one of the things that worries me, and this has started out personally, is that it's very easy, if you see the world as one big polycrisis, and everyone in this room, I'm sure, feels that, sees that, and knows that. But when you see the world as just lots and lots and lots of problems, it's very easy to actually, and this is a term someone used, to just despair. So we become this council of despair, and it actually becomes difficult to act. So how do we act when everything's a problem? Because I can't solve everything any more than any one of you here can solve everything. So what do? How do we actually act? Because it just then becomes this, we need a new term now, polyproblematique, that maybe will be, another term will come in 20 years. And I think we have to stop doing that. So my next slide is, again, no surprise to anyone here, but it does feel quite important. And I struggle with numbers, only numbers. I struggle with the idea that every day a classroom full of children are being killed by Israel in Gaza. I struggle with just the sheer brute of that number. And often I need a name and I need a face or something. And for me, personally, this was behind Rajab, who, all of you will know this. I don't need to say this to you. And as I hinted at the beginning, I do think that what's happening in Gaza is a real warning for the future. And I want to read a quote by someone called Liz Lowe Taylor, who's actually a photojournalist. She's not a writer by trade. And she wrote in a recent blog about what's happening in Gaza. And she said this: "The battlefield is the nursery, the bakery, the hospital. In the wars of the past, civilians were often collateral, rarely the target. Of course, now they are the target. Gaza's children are being crushed as they sleep, limbs severed in playgrounds, mouths silenced while they put that rare piece of bread in their mouths. When the bombs fall, they don't fall on barracks, but on bread lines. Yes, all wars are barbaric, but this is erasure." And I have a deep concern for what's happening in Gaza, but also what it suggests for the future, and what now is being seen as now precedent, that it's kind of okay, that we're crossing every line, at least in the past, governments pretended to follow those lines. Those lines, there's not even any pretense anymore. And I think we've got to be very, very careful about this in terms of the future. I'm sure, again, all of you know this writer. I love her work. And I think she speaks to a very particular thing that happens around childhood. And I think this has important ways of us to think about how we do research with children, and I'm going to say a lot about this, and it came up yesterday, about how we engage with young people and communities, because I think that, and what was so lovely about yesterday was seeing all the community engagement and talking to people on the ground, because I'm going to propose today that in fact that's the answer. It's not people like me who can run fancy randomized controlled trials with lots of PhD students and produce a lot of evidence that no one or hardly anyone ever uses. So I'm going to say that, and I love this work of here and around this concept of unchilding, and and actually she could equally be speaking of the experiences of children in many places. There was an American writer, I'm going to forget her name offhand now, who wrote a book called Childism. And she said that if you think about sexism, racism, her argument was the United States is guilty of childism. That when you can accuse a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, when you can try them as an adult, you're actually involved in some form of unchilding as well. And so this kind of discrimination, I think, is not just about what's happening in Gaza, in Palestine, in the region, but I think more widespread as well. And I think, and anyone who hasn't read Naomi Klein, I would strongly recommend, and she's got this concept of sacrifice zones, where there are places in the world, whether it's a place in Louisiana where there's a plant that's putting mercury into a river and killing participants, people in the region, whether it's Gaza, whether it's South Sudan, whether it's Yemen, where there are people that are less or seen as less than others, and they can be sacrificed to an economic model or something else. Now, why am I saying all of this? Because you thought that I was going to be talking about research, and I promise I will. But I'm saying this because I think we are in a stage in the world right now that, again, I don't need to say this to you, that being an objective, if that's even possible, researcher, I don't think is possible anymore. That in fact one has to be an activist as well. That this has to be about using research for activism, using research to show things that need to be shown, to make things visible, and to, in a sense, again, in this lovely book, particularly about, this is about physicians and medicine, but in fact, that in fact the first task of the doctor, and I would say here the researcher, is actually political. That it isn't objective, and hopefully I can make my case in the next 10 minutes or so. So I don't think it's about, we need the research to be methodologically as objective as we can, but in fact our results have to be used for activism, and they have to be political. So what do we know in terms of research? So I've been involved in a number of documents. I was as part of the group that met to come up with the guidelines, the WHO guidelines for improving early child development. As I said, I've run some of the studies. I was part of the Nurturing Care Framework. And I want to say today is, in fact, we really do know, in theory, in terms of evidence, what works. We know that ensuring children are fed, have adequate nutrition. We know that if they've got responsive caregivers in a very broad way, and I loved the talk last night around decolonialism and the work we've got to do with attachment theory and everything, but we do know what works. What we don't know is actually how to do it. We keep failing in how to implement, how to integrate our data. So I think we know what to do. So this is a report that I interviewed a range of people. This is for Grand Challenges Canada, and I can send this report to anyone who's interested. And you can see in the title, this is when I was still obsessed with this concept of polycrisis, and we used that term. And I'm just going to touch on a few of the little pieces of research from that. One was, and this wasn't just one person, but a number of people said this, was that we have to move away from the petri dish of the randomized control trial. And that's quite hard for me to hear. My whole career has been built on randomized control trials. But I firmly believe this now, that we've got enough randomized control trial evidence to say that we know what works. And we now have to find ways to take that evidence and either use it to inform our findings, or inform integration, or inform health system change, rather than depending on some fidelity to a very particular program. And why that's important, and this was a quote from another person, is that what we've done is we've got randomized control evidence from interventions, and then we somehow take that and we put that into a complex health system, and then, surprise, it doesn't work. And this person said, well, what we've been doing is it's a bit like putting only flour in an oven, and then waiting for an hour and expecting a cake. Yes. And then what we do, when we scale up, we now take that evidence, we take this non-cake, really, and we now try and integrate it into a system. And the first thing we do is we say, oh, the training was too long, so we shorten it. Or supervision, oh, that's supervision. No, we can't do that, so we'll cut that. And then we try and implement that. Guess what happens? It doesn't work. And so we need a new view. We need to shift away from this petri dish of the randomized control trial. So this is a very interesting article. It's got nothing to do with early child development. It's written by an economist, or no, law review, I think, and it was in the Boston Law Review. And what she does is she goes, and this is evidence, it's a systematic review only from the United States. So again, not about children and only about the United States. So you would think it's not very generalizable. But what she does is she goes and looks at all the interventions in the criminal justice system in the US around recidivism, around reintegrating people, around sort of trying to produce evidence within prisons, for example, and it's really with adults. And there have been thousands of interventions and programs. And what she then does is she puts an eye on that systematic review and she looks at it quite critically. And she says, did they look at whether there were any effects 2 years down the line, not just straight after? Did they register their trial so we know what analysis they were doing? What was the sample size like? And she takes all the evidence for the last 50 years, she makes the quite strict, but not insanely strict at all. And guess what the result is? There's no evidence of anything at all. In 50 years of research in the United States, every intervention really may have succeeded in a very short period afterwards, but not in the long term. And what she describes this as, she says, is that what happens, and this is, I think, very relevant for children in adversity, is that you give children, you take, in a sense, even if you're working within their community, you're in a sense in the intervention taking them out of that community. You give them this amazing intervention with their family, you then go away and you put them back in that community full of adversity, violence, fear, terror, and she uses the term stabilizers. And this is, again, for the criminal justice system, but those stabilizers pull people back to where they were before. And that unless you keep doing things over time, accepting the complexity of the system, that we're not going to have the effects we want. And so what we do is it uses the term, it's a bit like a bowl of oranges, is that imagine a bowl with one orange, and you take the oranges, the child, the family, the intervention, you move them up to the side of the intervention, to the side of the bowl. That's the success of the intervention in the short term. You go away, you don't keep doing things, what happens? The orange falls back. Or a piece of wood on the sea, where it's kind of going, but even the slightest wind that comes across, the slightest wave will shift the child, the intervention away. And so we need to do better. We're not focusing on what we need. And this is a quote from her. And this, I find this, both scary, worrying, a bit disillusioning for me, who've spent my life trying to do this research. But the idea that a small, she says inexpensive. Say, the word everyone we all use is cost-effective. So small, cost-effective interventions with large, widespread gains, and this is the important one, that last a long time, which for all of us in the room, we want whatever we do for young children to last their lifetime. That's why we're doing it. And in fact, that may be mostly a myth. So that's a bit worrying, certainly for me, but I want to keep hoping. And so I think one of the problems is we appear unable to think in complex systems. It's almost like we can't hold the level of complexity in our heads. And in some ways, this is, I think, around the poly crisis as well. If I'm dealing with war, climate breakdown, nutrition, the breakdown of the food system, it's very easy to just want to crumple down to the ground and start crying and not do anything. It's almost too much. And so we struggle with complexity. So then we design a nice, simple intervention that can be, can be done simply, and we imagine that if we scale that up, it'll work. And so I'm of the opinion, and I said this in a talk recently that I think Joan was at, was that I think people like me, academics, researchers, should never use the word scale up again. We don't know anything about scale up. People in government, people in NGOs, people on the ground, they know about scale up. Can we provide evidence and offer evidence to them to help? Absolutely. When they've thought of the complexity, because they know their system, and they now have integrated, implemented something, maybe then they can call us back. And we can help with monitoring, with evaluation, and even impact evaluation. But we don't know anything about scale-up. And that's maybe a generalization. In all my years, I think I knew things about scale-up, but I don't. I can use the words in a proposal, but I don't really know what that's about. People in government and on the ground do. So then, because we can't think in these systems, what do? In this incredibly complex system, we go in and we design A to B randomized controlled trials, simple trials that answer a single question, and then we think we can take that lovely little line out into the real world. And I don't think we can. We need something different. So, what at some level, what do children in a crisis really need? And I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And one of the things I was taught many years ago when I did my training was something called critical incident debriefing. I don't know how many of you heard of that. It's when someone experiences a trauma and a counselor, a psychologist is sent in, and the idea being that if, as soon as possible, the person, the child, the parent, whoever's experienced the trauma, tells you as much as they can about what happened, and that's seen as being good for them. Now, I've been trained in a lot of psychotherapies, a lot of interventions. We know that most of them work, pretty much. Sometimes CBT might work a bit quicker than something else, but they all kind of work because if there's a good relationship and there's care, they work, some quicker than others, as I said. The one we know that doesn't work is critical incident debriefing, and not only does it not work, it makes children and people worse. So we don't do that, and the field has moved. And so now what do? After a trauma, we keep the person warm, we give them some fluid, and what do? We get them back into their care system, their family. And the family then creates an environment to create a safe, call it a psychic space or something, to hold them, and for them to then kind of like settle down and take time, and then eventually get some therapy and get some CBT if needed. But the first instance is not to do an intervention to try and cure the situation. And so that enabling environment is utterly key. So how do we do the research in a sense that allows us to facilitate for children that enabling environment better to create a safe psychic space for them? That sense of safety and a sense of psychic space. Again, I don't need to tell that to anyone here. Now, and this is the last section of my talk, is that a recent study was done by WHO, and there's a set of 4 papers in the Lancet about it, where they looked at all the trials that were done during COVID-19. And there was something like 2,300 global randomized controls done. And they found that less than 10% of those trials had any impact on policy or practice. So 90% were essentially a waste of time, and certainly a waste of money. And one of their big conclusions was that one of the big gaps, and this is what was so lovely about yesterday, is the lack of engagement with community stakeholders, that so much research is top-down, researchers coming in, parachuting in and doing research. We're not talking to stakeholders, and we're definitely not talking to children. The lovely pamphlet that was shared this morning, it's so lovely to see children being interviewed in the pictures. I don't know, many of you will see it on your tables. The children are there, and we haven't been good at that. And when we do youth engagement and research, it's usually, and I'm guilty of this, terribly guilty of this, we get money from a funder, we design an intervention, and then what do we have? We have a child advisory group or an adolescent advisory group, which is great, and we should do that. But what do? They change a song, or they change a few pieces of the intervention. It's not real engagement. We should be engaging with children and families about what research do they want to happen. What do they need in their communities, rather than, and in humanitarian settings, we all know there's a long history of philanthropic, altruistic people from around the world kind of parachuting in after a disaster, a tsunami or something, and doing their things and then going home. Okay, I think that has shifted and that's changed, but that's not what we need. So, I love this quote, and I know it's a bit of a shift now to suddenly start talking about play. But one of the things about the polycrisis, I think that this counsel of despair is that it's easy to become so negative, so despondent, is one of the responses to that is to look at the small things in the world, to be able to get up and to, despite what's happening in Gaza, but to notice the sunset and those small things. And I think that we're privileged in this room, that when you work with children, we have access to a group of people who do this by nature. They play, they're curious, they look around, they experience trauma, but they also experience the most remarkable amount of joy in their daily lives. And we have the opportunity in this room and in our networks with the people that we work with and our colleagues to, I think, harness this joy, this notion of freedom for its own sake, to also provide lessons for everybody else in the world. And I think children offer that. Children offer a kind of a portal, I think, to a different way of being in the world. And so it's not about forgetting that there's a polycrisis or forgetting that there's horror, but it's also finding that other side of it to help us do the work that we want to do. I'm not going to do that slide, but I'm happy for the slides to be shared and everyone can look at that slides. I know I'm out of time. And I want to end with another quote that I love and I often use from Enrique Peñalosa, who was the mayor of Bogota many years ago. And his aim was to create a child-friendly city, because his idea was that if you create a child-friendly city, then everyone benefits. If you create sidewalks with enough space for children to safely ride a bicycle, then people in a wheelchair have a place to also be safe. Pedestrians, older people like me have a place to walk slowly and not have to run across and avoid cars and trucks. And so creating a city, and I think that, I've tried to argue this a lot, is that if we create a world that puts children and their needs at the center of things, that in fact you then create a world that's better for everyone. I don't want to lose hope, and I haven't. I still hope. I think we're in a position where we can still do things. And this is my favorite poet, an Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, who says, history says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. And I think we have to hold on to that. My last words, I promise, are that please keep this work happening with networks, with people on the ground, and talk to children. And I know that when you work with early child development, it's difficult to talk to a 2-year-old about what they want for their lives. I get that. But most 2-year-olds have a 9-year-old sibling or a 15-year-old sibling who in many cases, as we all know, is sometimes the caregiver of that 2-year-old. We have to talk to people, to young people, to children, to adolescents from the beginning, and based on what they know then develop our interventions and develop our research. We have to stop doing this in a top-down way. And thanks again for the invitation.